All right. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Morgan Newquist, and I write urban fantasy, and superheroes. And I am just going to mostly let everyone else introduce themselves first, and we'll start with Jaji, and then we'll get going.
Hello, I'm Aljaji Lamplighter, and I write Christian magic stories, by which I mean they're fantasy stories that basically take place in sort of a mainstream rather than Christian per se type of story, but they have Christianity working a bit like magic in the spiritual defense department, which I guess is the opposite of magic in a way.
My name is Declan Finn, the man, the myth, mostly the jacket. I've written about 35 books. Most of them are over half of them are urban fantasy. Mostly my 12-book series, St. Tommy NYPD, which is a long story we'll get into later.
Professor. What should I say? Okay, so my scholarship is in Devotion to Christ and Mary, and my big books are From Judgment to Passion, Devotion to Christ and the Virgin Mary, 800 to 1200, which is about the way in which the imagining yourself into the story becomes a part of Christian devotion in the Middle Ages. Mary and the Art of Prayer, which is the way Mary is described through the revelation of the Psalms in the liturgy. I'm also, I don't know whether this counts as spiritual warfare or not, but on my blog, Fencing Barrett Prayer, I did a series on Milo Yiannopoulos, and we published that as Milo Chronicles, which I guess is my handbook for spiritual warfare. And the poems and such that I've been talking about.
My name is Anne Margaret Lewis, and I write space fantasy as well as mysteries. And I give an example of each here. And I deal with definitely spiritual warfare in my science fiction series, my space opera series. That is going to be coming out again next year.
Okay, good. So I think before we delve into all of our works, I think it might be interesting if you can think of one on the spot. What are some, I know we're all indie, so we do our own things, but are there any examples in popular culture that are good examples? I know Catholics are often used in media and they're represented wrong or whatever. that use this concept of the supernatural powers coming from God or from religion versus like magic just out in the universe or some kind of unnamed pagan source.
Well, I know Jim Butcher, one of Harry Dresden's sidekicks, who should probably have his own novel. Michael is, he's a Knight of the Cross, and all of his powers do come from God, what few he has, and mostly they come from a sword where the pommel is made from one of the nails that crucified Christ. But aside from that, nothing comes to mind.
I'm Tolkien disabled, right? I'm going to say Tolkien because he does, right? And that he's the model, and the reason that he does and he is the model is because I've been talking about this a little bit this weekend. Lewis and Tolkien are different. Lewis is looking at this largely from the outside. I think he's an apologist, right? So he's trying to draw you in by way of his demonstrations. Although there's lots going on in Lewis, Tolkien is writing his world. And this is why I think he's always saying there's no magic in it. There's that when Galadriel shows Sam and Frodo her mirror, she's like, I think you might call this magic. But Tolkien is always about creativity, creation, subcreation, the light, the participation. And I think that's why people are puzzled by him saying it's a religious novel, because there's no temples in it and there's no human sacrifice. There is in Numenor. But he's trying to show you the view of reality that he inhabits in the mass, and that means I think rather than making the spiritual battle overt in that way, he's trying to show you it's like a psychomachia. It's the soul, it's the battle within the soul that he's illustrating.
That's why he said he hated allegory. It wasn't really
Right.
allegory, it was more of a metaphor.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm trying to think of. Can you give me that question again? Because I'm trying to think of what specifically you're looking for.
Just like representations of Christians in popular fantasy sci-fi that uses let's say like the power of God as a power source versus
Well,
the
you
kind of
got the movie
amorphous
The
magic.
Exorcist, maybe. You got which I still can't watch it because it freaks me out so badly. I cannot watch The Exorcist. But yeah, I know that you have the power of inhabiting this person and how the priest actually goes against it. And that's popular. So I'm trying to think of something else where you see the power of God really manifested, like in television shows and stuff. You don't see it all that often, but they certainly like to use the imagery, don't they?
Yeah.
Well, certainly with Dracula and Van Helsing, he holds that cross. He believes in that cross, and he holds it up, and it certainly repels Dracula. So that would probably work, don't you think?
There's also an Exorcist TV show that Fox did a couple of years ago. It's like very on the down low, and it's really, really good. There's one scene at the end of the first season where one of the priest characters in it blesses the lake to use in an exorcism. So he does like the whole bless of the lake thing and dunks the possessed girl in it. And it's really, they really kind of use the priest's powers
Turns
in
the
it
whole
in a
lake
way
into
that,
holy water.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
cool.
So there is. I realized I was prompted by an email to mention his book. Jim Papandrea did a book from Star Wars to Star Trek to something on actually how all these science fiction images of superheroes are all Christ, right? But I'm probably
yes, I've seen that, yeah.
but unfortunately they're mostly heretical. So they're either Arian or Gnostic. And he charts through. It's like which ones fit in which, was whether it's a descent of a power. Like Superman, who's otherwise unhurtable and descends into the world, or they are Aryan as an elevation. But one way or another, our entire superhero category is Christological. It's just most of the time they're. It's very hard to write Christ. We've been finding this in Draco Alchemicus too, because there is a Christ character, and we've said he has to be a character. But if you're trying to write Christ, he's God. How do you write that? It's a challenging. I mean, saints are easier because they're empowered with their participation in the faith, but God Himself, tricky.
I think we're seeing that with The Chosen. I don't know how many people actually watch the Chosen series. Writing Jesus is very difficult for them. I know that, but Jonathan Rumi he's really trying his best as he prays a lot.
In
He
the
prays a lot,
reviews
but
I've seen, he's not doing well, right? Because he's making him too familiar, right? Too jokey.
They're making him human, and there's that trying to find that balance.
Yep.
Trying to find the balance, that hypostatic union is very difficult, and Jonathan himself, who plays the character, would say it's a difficult balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, he admits that.
We can do our contesting who played Christ best, right?
Yeah.
Who
They
wore the white nightie best?
Yeah.
Jim Caviezel has entered the chat.
Yeah, Jim Caviezel has entered the chat. Yes.
But I think for me, this is the demonstration of the problem. It's like if you're writing a theological truth, there's mysteries that you're trying to capture that are difficult to portray.
And I think some of that's hampered sometimes by the theological view of the writers. So
So
Yeah.
back to
yeah.
There's lots of stories with angels and demons. They often don't have many angels and don't have much about God, but there's lots of demons which imply angels and God on TV. There was Joan of Arcadia, that God was not really our God. I would say it's not really any particular God, but it was a girl who God would speak to her and tell her to do difficult things. And if she did them, it would get worse and then suddenly better. So that was kind of a fun show.
There's of course supernatural, but then again, that is a theological mess. So
So that's
Well,
one
this
of
is-
the
I-
many
Train
lots of
wreck.
demons, very few angels, no real God shows.
Excuse me, you
it's
want
really
to talk
nice.
angels? There was this entire very mushy show in the '90s called Touched by an Angel.
Yeah.
Like,
So this is
kind of done to death with a crowbar.
And then there's Good Omens, which is another theological mess. But
segue into, I don't know, it's just like that. We actually, the man who played the angel in Supernatural character was actually a University of Chicago alum. And so I was asked once by the Alumni Magazine to comment on this devotional art that his fans have been making of him, right? And so she shows me all these like crocheted little characters and chainmail blanket faces, and I said, I understand this. Right? So there's if we're so within the storytelling, the problem of theology, our response to the stories is very interesting because I saw them as creating this fanfic, and then I said devotional art is fanfic because you're trying to be within the story yourself. So it's interesting which of the stories are going to create that kind of response.
So we were talking a little bit about how difficult it is to write Jesus, right? So, playing off of that, when you are using a religious source of power, how I think it makes it difficult because it's not just like magic, where it's like a source or a tool that a character can take and use for their ends however they want to use it. So if you write with that, or in other stories, how do you work that out? That the power is coming from someone else that is meting it out due to their own will rather than the will of the character.
Oh, that part's easy. With my St. Tommy NYPD series, which if you will check page 11 of the program is in this sale for book 1, I start him out very confused. The first time he bilocates, it's by accident.
I love that scene.
Yeah, he was doing his morning offering and just going through his prayers. Some idiot snatches a purse right in front of him. He has a giant NYPD hat, front and back, and the idiot still purse snatches in front of him. And, he's still praying as he's chasing after this guy, and he accidentally bilocates so that he's in front of the purse snatcher and just clotheslines him. And when the purse snatcher goes, "You ain't that fast. How'd you get in front of me?" And his honest response is, "I have no idea." And he is very confused about what's happening to him throughout. So I make it very clear, it ain't him. Pretty much from the get-go. And, part of book 1 ends with, how do I ask for this stuff to happen? Because he's very reticent about actually asking. But when it's, okay, I have only one solution to this problem, it's to request a miracle. I don't know how this happens, and then he finds himself actually bilocating without really knowing how he did it. Because he asked sideways. So that makes it quite clear. He's got no idea what he's doing. This ain't coming from him, and he got no control over it.
If I can talk a little more about St. Tommy, who I love very much. I think Declan does a super job of just exactly what we're discussing here, because throughout the entire 12 books, you never know when these things are going to happen. He has no control over it. Sometimes he prays and he asks for something. It doesn't happen. I can't tell why it doesn't happen, but it feels like what happens when sometimes you pray and sometimes you get a response and sometimes you don't. I mean, when it doesn't work, I don't feel like, it's arbitrary. It just feels like God has a plan, Yeah. And he prays when he fights, which is great. His prayers right in the story as he's fighting, which kind of cuts the fight scene in a cool way, kind of frames it. And he'll sometimes have the perfect miracle for exactly what he needs, and sometimes he just has to solve the problem on his own. Declan does a great job of it.
Actually, thank you for reminding me, because someone named Hans, who's sitting in the front row, suggested at one point that Tommy no longer have miracles throughout an entire book, and trying to figure out why. I think it was book 7. And so it was very clear, this ain't coming from Tommy. And the punchline was actually, well, a long joke that should be in a sermon, but I won't tell it here.
So I'm thinking, I write Christ more than I write any other characters, and it's like one writing Christ through the commentaries on scriptures, where they're trying to imagine through the words of the scriptures, marrying Jesus's intimacy and compassion. And then in the Milo Chronicles, which is another place I started, seeing patterns of a story that we're participating in. When I say write Christ, I think I'm usually rewriting Christ's story in the way in which we're recognizing ourselves in it. So I think with the St. Thomas, I don't do saints, and this I once meditated on this in a paper I did on Anselm's prayers to Christ, God, and the saints, and I started with saints bore me, which I was forced to rewrite too. I don't understand saints. That I'm most of my storytelling, either in my scholarship or in our poetry, is it's reflection, it's revelation, it's trying to say, how do we see Christ into these stories? This suggests to me maybe I do need the challenge of actually writing a saint in conversation with Christ, but I prefer, I'm still Protestant enough to want the direct approach. What I understand from Anselm's prayers to the saints is they are in different relationships with God, and you pray to them to sort of, I mean, it's kind of voyeuristic, but you're seeing their relationship with God. So Mary Magdalene has a very interesting prayer relationship in Anselm's imagination, when she meets him in the garden, and she thinks he's the gardener, and she calls him rabbi, and it's I'd be curious about the term. We were worrying about which side of our stories we were on. I'm Protestant enough to just want to meditate on Christ rather than on the saints and their relationship with God, and that probably does also affect your story structures.
I think it's when you think of saints, they're people who had a relationship with Christ, as you said, right? And what we do is we see them as, they are our sisters and brothers in Christ, and they've been through these problems before. So we ask them to pray to God for us on behalf of those problems that we're having. So they kind of are just our prayer partners in tackling those specific things. Now with St. Tommy, who's a living saint, he doesn't know what the heck's going on. So if we were to ask St. Tommy to pray for us, he'd say, okay, I pray for you to get what you need, but I have no idea what this is about. So, but as a person, he would pray for you as a brother in Christ. So when you see them that way, when you understand that you're just talking to a fellow Christian who needs, who has been through these things, like St. Mary Magdalene, I chose her as my patron saint. Okay. And I did because my joy in my life would be to see the risen Christ as she did. That was my choice in her. I said, I want to see the risen Christ. Can you help me do that? Can you pray for me that I do that? So that's why she is my patron saint. So maybe that'll help.
The thing is, it makes sense but then I say, I mean,
you're hearing a bunch of Catholics talking about Catholic things. Sorry about this, guys.
But they are the models for the superheroes.
Right, are the models for the superheroes.
Are they, right? Is the superhero the model of Christ, or is it the saints? And then it's like Superman is a kind of Gnostic Christ, right? Or somehow the saints are different, and maybe that's when we talk about the problem of we're doing these supernatural characters.
Well, if you look at St. Augustine was a horrible sinner for the longest time, and he was a mess. And his mom prayed for him, please, help this guy straighten out. And when he did, he became one of the greatest thinkers in the church. So it's a story of conversion. Everybody has a story of conversion in their lives.
Not to mention, sorry.
No, I'm not going to. I got to get to my book eventually. But how I pray. No, it's good.
Also, one of the
Declan,
things with the saints is they're so different. They are all over the place, personality-wise. You had St. Lawrence, who was literally griddled to death, and while he was being cooked, he literally cried out, "Okay, you can turn me over. I'm done on this side."
It's a funny guy.
Yeah, I think he's also.
So the story goes.
Yeah, I think he's also supposed to be patron saint of comedians. But St. Ignatius Loyola was a soldier. Thomas Aquinas was a scholar. St. Francis liked nature and animals. So they're all different people. So we can all see a slice of how to interact with God. They're all different ways. It's basically one big ball of yarn that goes to the same place at the end of the day.
And like you have saints also have different things that they did throughout their lives that were very interesting. Like Saint Francis, we talked about him. Yeah, he did love animals, and he preached to the birds, which is very interesting. But one of the things he also did, he was quite ballsy. I mean, there's a number of things that he did. When he decided to follow Christ, he took, I mean, he was the son of a rich man, and he renounced all of his wealth. He literally went and took off all of the clothes that he had from his father, gave him walk through the streets naked to go, so that's how committed he was. And he was so committed that he went to the Middle East and preached to the Sultan the message of Christ. And the Sultan said, if all Christians were like you, I would follow him. So, that's how important Francis was. That he was a very ballsy person. So he wasn't just, hi, happy joy with animals and I love you. No, he was pretty tough. He was a pretty tough guy. Yeah.
One of the first stories I got to edit was a young man in Singapore wrote a story about St. Francis and a dragon. And I thought it was quite delightful. As a Protestant, I look at the saints the same way the Japanese handle Christianity and anime. It's like this great raw material that you can do all these wonderful things with. And my particular Protestant church does not have any enmity towards saints. In fact, I was really kind of shocked when I found out that other Protestants kind of thought of saints as just being Catholic, because I'm like, but they're from the whole Christian tradition. I thought that they belong to all of us. But I think they're great, like the fairy tales and the myths and other things. They're wonderful things to pull from for stories. I don't think I have any scenes with saints in anything that's published, but I did have a lot of fun when in my Prospero series, when the main character went to her father's, to Prospero's treasury, he had a tent that Paul had made and a wheel that Jesus had made back when he was a carpenter. And when the king of Jinn burnt the room, the wheel wouldn't burn, and the Jinn got really upset. So you can do really, really fun things with them, and just give them the same kind of honor that they kind of deserve for what they've brought to us,
Now, I wanted to get really quick to what Morgan's original question was. We were talking about how we handled the power not coming from them. And the characters that I have are, they're Nephilim, but they work, the way I did Nephilim is that they are humans that took upon themselves another curse, okay? Had the curse in the garden, and a demon tricked them. He went and stole another fruit from the garden and had them eat that. And what that did is he gave them the promise, I will give you back what was taken from Adam. Well, he didn't really. They aren't immortal, which is one of the features of that Adam had. But a lot of the abilities that he had is to talk with God, to walk with God, those sorts of things. They don't have all of that, but they have a good portion of it. So their abilities come from what we should be ultimately in our resurrected bodies. They're not quite there because they are still fallen beings. So how I handle it is that they have this constant battle, and they will, if they start to go down the wrong path, they quite literally turn into physical demons. So that's how I handled it. They can see it starting to happen. If they make mistakes, if they start to go against the will of God, they will start to quite literally start to change. And they know that they have to go and cleanse themselves in the temple. To be clear, and it's almost a combination Jewish. They're almost like Jews in space, which I thought was kind of funny that you guys had the Jews in space panel. But that's kind of what they have that they can actually hear God's voice in the temple. They can hear Him speaking to them, which is what Adam could do. So that's how I do it. Is they know when they're doing something wrong because they will quite literally physically change.
If we want an example of something outside of our genre, the movie Millions does a great job of saints. There's one thing that I don't like, which is here they have all these saints coming into the world, and then they stop to try to explain away the miracle of the loaves and fishes as if it didn't happen. And that kind of ruins the
Everybody
movie for me.
shared their lunch. Don't you know that?
but the rest of it, where this little kid will suddenly see saints and they'll come, Joseph and stuff comes and talks to him, is actually, I thought, rather charmingly done.
Okay. No, it's fine. I was going to play off of that in that, we're talking a lot about the saints and how they can be used. But everyone spends a lot of time when they're writing coming up with world building and everything. But there's I use the term loosely, but there is a long history of Christian lore that tends to be untapped for fantasy stories. Like my husband just texted me about this one because everyone was talking about Saint Francis, but there's a story that Francis actually tamed a wolf, right?
Yeah, the
And
dragon story
I'm trying to
played off of that.
what is the whole thing with the werewolves with Francis? I can't remember.
Mm. Yeah.
So,
It's Gubbio in Italy.
yes. And
Gubbio, yeah.
so, it's only a small leap to go from that to these are St. Francis's werewolves, right? Like a whole line of werewolves that came from St. Francis. And there's so much of this if you go and look at it. And I did not grow up Catholic. I'm a convert. And so all of it was new to me. And some of it is with the saints and some of it is other stories. And I just wanted to bring that up as something that's really, I think, underutilized in fantasy fiction.
I tend to agree.
Yeah.
And in support of all of those, wanting more of those elements, for Draco Chemicus on our website, of course, because I'm a professor, I have a syllabus, right, of the reading that we're doing in writing Draco Chemicus, which includes things like the historical narratives that we're working on the spice trade and so forth, but also references on mythology and symbolism and so forth. And what I find sort of sad and startling is medieval historians know all of this, and many of us became medievalists because we were reading Tolkien and Lewis and such. Modern Catholics don't seem to know it that much. I've learned that in the talks I've been invited to give. And what you're saying is, and storytellers aren't using it, but it's out there. I mean, we have references. We've been studying all of this stuff for a good century in the scholarly context. So on my website on dragoncommonroom.com, if you go, Draco Chemicus behind the scenes, there's a reading list of places you can find more of this.
I'm
wanna
sorry, what was
talk-
the original question?
There wasn't a question. She was
It's kind of
observing
a
the.
discussion on Christian lore being used
Okay.
as a basis
I have
for
Christian
fantasy.
lore. Go to the
Yeah.
website.
If you want the really
I
cool
will.
Christian lore for Francis that's seldom used, it's the belief that Francis was given Lucifer's throne in heaven. It just seems like there's lots of potential there for cool stories,
That's
but
cool.
I
Yeah.
haven't seen it used very much.
You can even go to Wikipedia, and they haven't screwed that up that much. Hopefully,
You're giving them Wikipedia when I gave them my website? Please.
I used Wikipedia. I didn't use your website,
You will
and
now.
then I used the several Catholic bishop sites that actually knew what the hell we're talking about. But no, lore is easy. It's either you can either go. The serious version is Butler's Lives of the Saints. The quote unserious version, is the Golden Legend, which is just plain fun and converted more than a few people to sainthood.
Including
And-
Francis at Loyola.
Loyola.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe it was a cannon. I want to say it was a cannonball entry, but that sounds wrong.
It was.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yay.
I got it right. I can actually remember something, but no.
But it
and-
was
and-
the Lives of Saints and Ludolf of Saxony's Life of Christ. So he had both.
But no, it's actually fairly easy to wind up using the lore. I with St. Tommy, I basically decided, okay, the Catholic Church has a lot of rules, so I basically used it for my world the way some people would use RPG manuals, because I got the rules, I got the mythology. Why not use it? And I actually wound up using the Francis and the Wolf story in this one, book 11, where, in one of the books, a demon the size of a kaiju emerges out of the ocean, and everyone with downward-facing satellite goes, "What the bleep is that?" To the point where, yes, now governments have supernatural research divisions, even the Chinese, and, my character is cornered by a Chinese Spec Ops division in the Bronx Zoo, and my character starts talking to the Chinese Spec Ops guys about this story of Francis and the Wolf, And the head of the team realizes a little too late that A, they're in the predator section of the zoo, and B, it's gotten very quiet. Despite all the machine guns going off, hilarity ensues. So yeah, lore is easy. It's, spend 5 minutes of research. Even if you do Padre Pio, who is the Swiss Army knives of having miracles and we call them charisms, and he was fairly, I want to say, laid back blue collar priest, but that takes a while to explain, and I'll shut up now.
Hey, in Book 11, does he actually speak Chinese without knowing it?
At points, yeah.
Yeah, I love
The
it when
speaking
that
in tongues,
happens.
yeah, the speaking in tongues bit
Is actually
confuses
using
him.
languages. I just love that. Real quick, this is a true story about the goop. Speaking of legends and things like that, when I was in a CC back in the 80s, I was there on study for 3 months, and they took us to a CC to see the Giotto paintings and everything else. This is pre-earthquake. The professor knew the monks in the monastery where St. Francis had been. And they took us in and walked us. We were able to go into the back where all the monks lived and things like that. And they showed us the rock that St. Francis slept on. And they introduced us to the birds that he preached to, or the descendants of the birds because he actually preached to them. And I guess you could think of it of him practicing his homilies or whatever, but he would do it to the pigeons outside. And those pigeons, the descendants of those pigeons, are still outside. And so yeah, these are their descendants. I thought that was just like
Francis's
cool.
pigeon. I'm like,
Francis's
this is going in
pigeons.
our story.
And
Yeah.
it's like, oh, that's another little cool legend. It's like maybe those pigeons can be like carrier pigeons. Maybe those, you never know.
In Draco Chemicus, we're all about pigeons. They're the messengers.
But why did it have to be pigeons?
I don't know what
I
the
don't know.
original
They're doves. Actually, I think they're doves.
I don't know what
Same.
the
Pigeons and doves are the same.
original
Yeah,
word was in the original language, but in the English translation of the Bible, it says, "You go forth and preach to every creature." So I have a list of things
Probably why I did it.
that's what I was thinking. So the creature preachers, I have a list of things you could have developed out of Christianity that we didn't, including having a prayer closet in your house, passing a rope around to symbolize handling serpents, preaching to creatures. And I have these all in a notepad. So someday I'll have a character go to an alternate world and it'll have Christianity, but they will have developed these other things that are a little different from the things that we developed. But in my current series, I decided I really didn't want my sorcerers to be evil. Well, some of them are evil, but so I decided I was going to pick the basic powers they had and derive them from gifts that God gives to Adam. So that sooner or later someone will find this out and they'll show that these races of human beings are allowed to do this magic. Some of them were a really tight fit. I didn't quite have something, but some of them were really straightforward. He's given dominion over this, and then that comes into a power. In my latest book, my main character has now been clearly told some of the powers you're learning at school are evil and some are good, but nobody's been able to tell her which are which. So she can look into that in the future. But I really just love the idea, okay, there's certain things that we're allowed to do, and it comes from God, and it's not out of our nature, because otherwise you end up in this situation where all the cool things, all the cool magics are somehow forbidden, and human beings aren't supposed to use them, which may be true in real life, but it doesn't make for very good fantasy stories,
So that does actually make me think of something. So I did a course ages ago on spiritual exercises, which I was having people practice spiritual exercises, and which was challenging because you have to do analogies of things like hesychasm, because otherwise the demons will get you. But we read both Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and the Rule of St. Benedict and Gregory's dialogues describing St. Benedict. And interestingly, the powers that Benedict gets are very like the ones Patanjali describes from spiritual training. So there you go. There's a potential for a monk, a powerful monk. And they include things like the bilocation, levitation, knowing people's thoughts, and so forth. And it is interesting that in these spiritual training traditions, we have enough in our present culture with all the mysticism of the East and such. Well, we've got it too, and it comes out of similar sort of asceticism and prayer practices and so forth. So there's you can use that. Benedict, as the training according to the Benedictine rule, will end up with and includes fighting demons, being able to see demons and cast them out and detect poisons and things like that. These are good powers.
I just save time and punch demons in the face. I'm easy.
One of the lines in the game that my current series is based on was one of the characters said to my character, she fights evil directly. And I never figured out what that meant, but I think that Declan has it down.
All right, so I actually kept the program up here because I thought, the questions in the summary were really good, and I wanted to make sure that we addressed some of them. And what we were just talking about leads into this one. So it's in secular fiction, superpowers are generally presented as something morally neutral arising from accidents. But does that make sense in a universe where good and evil and God and Satan are real, like ours? Do superpowers have a moral valence? And I want to bring that up because you were mentioning.
I'm going to come at this one a slightly odd way, but my dad, who was a Jew who became a Buddhist, and I guess he was kind of a Christian by the end of his life, believed that psychic powers were real, but they were a trap, that you developed them as you got closer to God, but that you shouldn't pay any attention to them. Otherwise, as if the devil was, I mean, he wouldn't put it this way, but as if the devil was offering you power that you could misuse. And while I'm not sure I really, agree with his take on it, I've come upon other things that had a similar idea that maybe, God gives gifts to some people, but it's really easy for them to go awry. So I guess one of the questions is, do any of these powers come out of nowhere, or are they being offered, like anything else in life, as an opportunity that can either draw you closer to God good or easily draw you away? In fact, I think one of the reasons Superman is such a hero is that everybody knows most people wouldn't do what he does with those powers. Most people would be tempted to do other things, and therefore the guy who stays upright and good is somebody really admirable.
Can I'll point something out from scripture here? You got this problem of Moses in the desert, right? With the water, and he strikes the rock, and he does it of his own volition. God did give him that power to bring water from the rock. However, he did that on his own without asking for God's permission to do that, and it still worked. So why would that happen? And you realize God gives us gifts all the time, right? And he did give Moses that gift, and he gave him that, but what made it wrong is that Moses kind of got bigger than himself. And so that was his temptation. He wanted to shut these people up who were grumbling and everything. So he just struck the rock and said, here's your water. Was that the right way to do it? I don't know. What do you guys think of that? And how would you interpret that? Someone is raising their hand back there, but you want to
Well, okay. So think about
Questions later.
answer the question. The greatest gift God given us is our storytelling and naming things, right? It's like, what does Adam do? He names the animals, and our reason. And I said, go to Chesterton. I got to get this book. That our figuring stories out, our understanding mysteries, our thinking through. Our creativity is our great gift from God, and it's like magic is a subset of that desire for creation and power. And in Draco Alchemicus, one of the Nephilim, right? One of the things we've been thinking about is all of the spells that humanity falls under, that are the dragon spells, which are sins. And our first one is metallurgy, right? Because it's the gift of the Enochian angels. And the second one is eye makeup, so cosmetics. And that what we're trying to show in Draco Alchemicus is the way we get ensorcelled into these temptations, but the challenge and the problem is, of course, they're temptations because they're also the flip side of our creativity. So, making things out of iron, good or bad, is beauty, sexual beauty and attraction, good or bad. As we're going on to the alphabet and music and propaganda and families and stuff like that. But the sort of mystery of our fallenness is constantly in the mystery of the powers that we started, which was naming things and telling stories and participating in the image and likeness in which we are made, which is creativity. And I think, in our Draco Alchemicus, magic and science are the same thing, right? That is the temptation of modernity. And I talked about this in my first BasedCon talk when I'm talking about the Ring of Sauron. Is it science or magic that you can make a thing that controls communication? Well, ask John Carmack, right? That AI is a desire of communication and so forth. So I think, to me, the story is, in fact, those temptations to the use or misuse of our own gifts.
The problem with the question is powers, any kind of power, is itself morally neutral. It's what you do with it. Thomas Aquinas, and sorry for bringing in philosophy, but Thomas Aquinas talked about how evils are imperfect goods or goods used in the wrong manner. Knives are supposed to be sharp. Planes are supposed to fly. But if you use box cutters to take over an airplane and run them into buildings, that's bad. No matter how good the planes are, no matter how good the sharp objects are supposed to be, they were used for evil. They are still morally neutral. And frankly, talking about secular fiction and superpowers, does that make sense in a universe where God and Satan are real? Well, you take the Marvel universe, where they have literally punched Satan in the face a few times. You have Ghost Rider, who is literally, I don't know, depending on who's writing it, he's either a demon or an angel, and I don't think they've made up their minds. But it all depends on who's writing it. So I have a problem with the question itself. And the entire founding philosophy of the Marvel Universe seems to be, do I have to repeat the Spider-Man line, with great power? Yeah, and they echo that every bloody month. So yeah, it's, again, there isn't even morally neutral in these secular fiction superpowers. I mean, the Thing from the Fantastic Four is Jewish. I think Peter David decided that at one point because, it hasn't been mentioned, so why not? Daredevil is depressingly Catholic. It's like, dude, St. Augustine was happy by the end of his life. Relax. And other religions vary depending on what's going on. And one of the better characters in Marvel is one of their most religious, which is Nightcrawler, where, every time somebody posts, random comics on Facebook by page, Nightcrawler shows up, he says 2 lines, he has stolen the entire moment, and wow, this was actually profound. Why don't they do more with him? Answer, because I think only Chris Claremont knows what to do with him.
Okay. I think we've got about 10 minutes, so I thought maybe we'd open the floor for questions.
Anybody got questions? Go ahead.
To what extent do you sort of see using the theme to invite into the using this sort of
I don't specifically try to write to a Christian audience. Like I said, I use the mythology as a whole, philosophy. I use the rule book of the Catholic Church like an RPG manual, but I do not stop to preach at people. I do not do Hallmark movies, unless somebody has a Hallmark movie where there's a lot of explosions and maybe a few fight scenes along the way. I won't go into what I've done to New York City.
A lot of fight scenes along the way. I'd like to tease him.
No, but I think it's a good question, and I've thought about this a lot because there is a large group of Christian fantasy and science fiction writers right now, and I have a good friend who's very active in this world. She does a review site. She won't read or review my books because they have witches in them who cast spells. Mm-hmm. So they have very kind of limited ideas about some of the books are good, but they have limited ideas about what they'll accept. I always think of my works as just sort of being in the real world. You run into Norse creatures, you run into Japanese creatures, you run into angels, it's all there. So I don't think of it in any way as being written to a Christian audience. It's just a fantasy story that takes place in a Christian world. And one of my main problems is Christians are much more quickly to attack if you are one step away from their particular Christian idea than the non-Christians are, you know. So I had, you know, that makes it difficult. But I'm trying to present a fantasy Christian world that has certain ideas that I'm not claiming they're the real ones. They're the ones that fit this story. You know, I try not to cross anything that's obvious. You
Yeah.
know, but
Heck, Narnia can be read by anybody. Let's face it. Some of the biggest fans I know are Jews, and the problem with saying I am writing for a Christian audience. Some of my biggest fans are Protestants of varying flavors. They see my work as, you know, general Christian, maybe, but they like the fight scenes. And I've gotten some negative reviews from Catholics saying, he's glorifying violence. I'm not glorifying violence. Have you seen how many times my main character ends up in the hospital? The hospital bills alone is a bit of a problem. So you can't really write to the Christian audience because you never know what you're going to get. And because there are, again, so many variations of Christians, even within individual sects, denominations, even if it's, you know, you're talking to a Jesuit instead of a Franciscan.
yeah.
You know?
Boy, they're different.
So it's too many flavors to say, I'm writing for a Christian audience. I'm writing for me, and I'm really hoping there are a lot of people who are looking for Christian fiction that is not wishy-washy nonsense. You know, they're not Hallmark movies with no stakes. And that's one of the things that pisses me off about Christian fiction. That's so nice. That is so pleasant. Where everything is a first world problem and, you know, hell isn't even an option. It's their personal unhappiness in this world. Who cares? I'm a little frustrated about that nonsense. Go ahead. I'll rant forever.
You could be in academia. So
His daddy would like that.
no.
If you need me to speak for 3 hours, I'm good right now.
I think I was thinking about that when you're answering it. My experience is like with an academic audience, you're not allowed to believe. And you are, and Lewis, this is why I say Lewis gives me a better entry into the problem than Tolkien does, although I'm always modeling myself on my desires on Tolkien, that Lewis understands the problem of the inside and the outside of the beam. You have this meditation, his little essay on meditation in the tool shed, where he's standing in the tool shed and he sees a beam of light coming through the crack in the door, and from outside the beam, he's in darkness, and there's this beam of light. And you can see the beam of light, and you see little motes dusting it and everything, and it's there, right? It's a thing you can observe. Whereas if he steps into the beam, looks along it, he can see, the sun, right? And Lewis was really keen on astronomy, so when he stays, I can see the 93 million miles away, the sun, and he uses this to meditate on the difference between social science, which is looking at the beam. Anthropology, sociology, political science, economics, everything is looking at, right? You're not participating in. Whereas, my scholarship, and this is where it's like all of the things I've been canceled for, the one that I got canceled for most effectively in certain senses is my desire to step inside the beam and look along Christian, truth to God, say that in the acknowledgments to my book, and then been told that therefore I'm no longer writing scholarship. And it's, I frame that as this kind of intellectual exercise of perspective, but, I think Christians are always talking to it's like Augustine. It's like you've got different audiences who need to be drawn into the story, and you have to figure out which one you're talking to at any given time. And academia is, for me, the hardest one because we have the knowledge, but we don't want to step inside and look along it to the vision that it gives. And I don't know whether that's the same kind of problem in the storytelling world, but it is definitely a problem in my storytelling world.
In terms of speaking to a Christian audience, I mean, I write what's in my heart and in my life, or that I'm going to tell a story that I like, all right? And I happen to come from a Christian worldview. I would say that's true for pretty much everybody here, is that you're going to write a story, and I don't care who reads it. I've had Jewish people read my book and they liked it. I've had, one of my friends is Greek Orthodox and he really liked it. I've had Protestants read it and they said they liked it too. So it was something that I told from and just because I happen to be Catholic, it's part of that universe. It's like using the rule book. It's like an RPG game, kind of like what he said. And I, and I think that's true. I know Mormons who do the same thing. Battlestar Galactica is written from the Mormon point of view, their view of the universe. So when you do that, you can't help it. That is who you are, right? So you tell the stories that are good. I am not going to try to publish in Christian publishers. I'm just not. That's just not. My book wouldn't be taken anyway because it has too much of a liturgical view to it. Do you know what I'm saying? So they wouldn't like it. So, liturgical. I'm sorry. The word liturgy comes from is it service? All right, and it really is. When we talk about liturgy, it is a form of worship that culminates in a meeting with God in some way. All right. For us Catholics, it is the Mass. It is a structure of worship that came from the Jewish tradition, because the whole first part of that worship service is from synagogue worship service, and it leads to what we say the fulfillment of the law is, which is a sacrifice. For us, worship is sacrifice, but we participate in the one true sacrifice on the cross. Okay, so liturgy is a form of worship that is structured. Okay, that has that structure that is leading to that culmination of meeting with God. Okay, so, and it's structured that way. A lot of Protestant, they have praise and worship where, you'll have someone preach for a while, you may have a reading, you may, it depends, you may have the Quakers have their own liturgy, believe it or not. They sit in silence and look at each, they ponder something, and so liturgy is the structured form of worship. So that's what that means. So when you come from a more Orthodox or ancient Christian or even Jewish tradition, you're going to have that sense of liturgy throughout everything you create because it's formed in who you are. Does that make sense? I hope so. I hope I didn't lose you. All right, go ahead. All right, questions out there?
Yeah, we'll take one more question. I saw Gail earlier.
I can't. I can't talk from a main Protestant point of view. I'm actually a Christian Scientist, and we have some things in common with normal Protestants, and we also have some things in common with Catholics that we don't have in common with normal Protestants. But I can talk from my point of view of why I tend to take a kind of Catholic approach about my fantasy, and that is my I won't say my religion, my church's take on Christianity is almost entirely intellectual. And to write a story, it has to be allegorical. I don't mean that it has to be allegorical in the sense that Tolkien and Lewis argue about. I mean that you need a hell that has demons that you can punch so that your character can interact with it. You know, if everything is too cerebral, there isn't anything to put on the page for your character to do. So I realized very early in my attempts to write stories that while my views can inform certain things about my story, I have to have a much more sort of concrete approach. And the Catholics, with the saints and the liturgy and the way they see things, it's in the 2,000 years of tradition, it's so beautiful and it's so concrete that a lot of things that you want to put into a fantasy, if you want your character to deal with these things, are going to kind of automatically easily fall across those lines. I'm not saying that every doctrinal issue is going to be Catholic versus any given, already exists an idea. Sometimes they just, what you do with an angel or a demon is just what fits your story. It's not a doctrinal issue.
Right.
But I think that one of the reasons that I think you're right that there is a great imagination. I mean, just look at the cathedrals. There's so much thought has been put into the Catholic tradition that it's really kind of inspiring to draw from.
One thing, if I could add to that, there's a sense of what some of writers that I interact with, and you probably do too, Gail, there's this idea of a sacramental imagination. Now, what do we mean by sacramental? That's another big word. We could talk about liturgy. Sacraments are an outward sign that grace is being confirmed, okay? What that goes, let me get down to the core of the matter here. What that means is you have the outside world. Through the outside world, we can access grace, okay? God touches us through the world that he created, okay? It's something, we believe that this body that we have, the body and soul were never meant to be separated. We weren't meant to die, right? So everything that is in this world is meant to interact with us, and that means also God's grace, okay? And so what the Catholic imagination does, and what the ancient world did, is that the outside world is important to us. And so you access it through touch and through all these things. And so I'm trying to think of where I'm going with this, but I kind of touched on this, is that superpowers are accessed in the real world, right? We see them, and that is God interacting with us. And I think when the Protestant world came about, 500 years ago, they got rid of the iconography. They pushed all that stuff away, and it became almost, it's not quite, a Gnostic sense that anything through the physical world is evil. Anything, but the world is beautiful. God created it. The world is only fallen because of us. However, God can reach us through the physical world. God, through our ears, through our, part of the reason that we have the sacraments, like confession. Let's talk briefly about confession.
No.
Briefly, I'm trying
Our
to...
panel ended 5 minutes ago.
I know.
We confess that we have more to say.
We have more to say, and I would talk about, if you hear God forgives you, you hear it through your ears. That's the reason why it exists. You're accessing it through your senses, okay? So that is kind of the difference, I think, between the two kinds of viewpoints in writing fiction.
See, we are all actually preaching to you. What the last thing that I sort of as a umbrella thought about this is what I love about science fiction and fantasy, and why we're all here and we enjoyed, is it enables us to ask these questions, right? That we have, it gives us a context in which to explore these sorts of, they're not necessarily counterfactuals, but the difficulties that we have thinking of ourselves solely in that flat materialist world. We in our stories, none of us want that. We want understanding, and that's why I said but history is similar. When I said in my previous talk that there is a theology underlying all the storytelling that we're doing, and this is, it's lovely that in fantasy we are, to a certain extent, forced to confront that and think about it.
You asked at the beginning about, this is my last sentence. You asked at the beginning about Christianity in popular culture. And to answer Gail's question, I think there's a reason why the Protestant German in Dracula goes and gets holy wafers and a crucifix.
All right. This is now an inclusion of the Catholic panel.
Hold the crucifix.
Anyway.